Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'd like to discuss a couple of things that are very near and dear to my heart, and that are bacteria and germs. All right. Bacteria are everywhere. Everyone's aware of germs and how dirty things are. We associate bacteria with things that we don't consider clean. But most of us don't give a lot of pause to just how clean things are, specifically in the dentist office, the hospital, tattoo shop, podiatrist. In 2011, there was an estimated over 700,000 hospital-associated infections that were reported in the U.S. alone. These hospital-associated infections cost over $30 billion. In 2013, there was an Oklahoma dentist that exposed over 7,000 people to HIV and hepatitis through lack of proper sterilization, understanding, and technique. And most recently, the CDC had an anthrax scare that involved inappropriate sterilization practices within one of their biosafety level 3 laboratories. We expect hospitals to be clean. We expect the dentist offices to be clean. But how do we know? And how do they know? There's a difference between sanitization, disinfection, and sterilization. Sterilization being the complete destruction of all living organisms, rendering something sterile. A brief history of sterilization, if you guys want to read through that real quick. 1860s, pasteurization kind of led to the field of reducing infection during surgery. Joseph Lister, an English surgeon, developed antiseptic technique for performing surgery. The autoclave is a very important apparatus in this whole process. We have lots of different means and methods of sterilizing equipment or rendering things sterile. Steam sterilization being the most prevalent, the fastest, the safest, and most reliable. We also use ethylene oxide, plasma, gasification, and vaporized hydrogen peroxide. These are some of the very more common methods of sterilization. When something is processed in an autoclave, let's say at your dentist office, and they go to do some cleaning on your teeth, they grab the instruments out of an autoclave and they verify that the instruments are indeed sterile by looking at chemical strips that change color when exposed to heat and steam that are on the bags. They look at mechanical verification, such as the gauges, printouts, timers on the autoclaves themselves. But then there's also biological indicators, which uses live bacterial spores in a known quantity. It's very difficult to kill, very difficult to sterilize unless it reaches the appropriate temperature, pressure, and time. So here's what we've seen as Southwest Sterilizers out in the field. A lot of places don't know what they're doing. A lot of places use equipment until it breaks. Problem being is that they don't necessarily know that it's not functioning properly until it just completely stops working. We've had a couple instances where we've been called to do repairs on autoclaves that quite possibly had stopped sterilizing long before they knew there was a problem because they relied on chemical indicators or mechanical indicators. A lot of people we run into is little or no training and no developed internal protocols. We are seeing labs, we are seeing offices that do have relevant structure and training built in, but it's few and far between, and quite honestly, it's not the norm. It's not very common. A lot of people that are using biological indicators are using them at random intervals. So the CDC recommends the use of biological indicators on a weekly basis. The New Mexico State Health Department recommends using biological indicators on a weekly basis. The current problem is that with using biological indicators, which is the most effective means of sterilization, verification, is that it takes days or weeks to get the results. A lot of these offices will run a biological indicator on a Friday. They'll mail it out to a lab in California or Ohio. It takes a couple days in transit, takes another 2 days for incubation, and then at least another day for verification. So the equipment that they process today to work on you, they won't know if it was actually in a working autoclave or sterilized for at least a week. The best practices are appropriate biological testing using the CDC recommendations, cycle verifications using mechanical and chemical means, the creation and use of logbooks, and weekly testing for general use and per cycle for medical implants, dental implants, surgical implants, and the regular service evaluations. And this is where we come in. Southwest Sterilizers, we provide local personalized service. We have free drop-off and pickup of BIs. We offer same-day results. So we took that process. We partnered up with 3M Healthcare last year, purchased some equipment, and came up with a process to where we can monitor and verify in the same day that this equipment is functioning properly. We offer on-site training, service, repair, and regular and automatic service intervals for some of these more busy shops. If they need somebody to come in weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, just to do a checkup or evaluation of their systems. Some of the biggest challenges we've had is market acceptance. A lot of places that are currently using biological indicators are certain that they're using them appropriately. They're happy with the service they're getting, and they're great until we get that panicked phone call on a Wednesday afternoon saying we got a failed test result. And they have to wait another week to know if any repairs have actually improved the problem. Market awareness. A lot of businesses that we've gone into, dentist offices and so forth, are not aware of exactly what best practices are. They're not really aware of all the options that are out there. And then market penetration. We've got a huge market here in New Mexico. Not only research laboratories, microbiology departments, veterinarian hospitals, dental offices, but we're having a hard time kind of penetrating into those worlds. We've gone door to door, we've done some direct mailing, we've done some email, and quite honestly, we're getting the biggest bang for our buck out of a website that just sits there and does nothing. So we're wanting to be a little bit more proactive and hoping that this group could help. So, questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much. Always great getting that. So the way that this will work is in order to capture for the video, I'll try to repeat your question. Do we have any questions from the audience about how we might be able to help Sean in his business?
Will you tell us who does use your services so we can go there?
So who does use your services?
We have contracts with C&M for their biology research department. We have a contract pending with Tricor Reference Labs. We have a contract with VCA Animal Hospitals, and we have a contract with one local tattoo shop, Tinta Cantina. So if you need to get your dog or cat looked at, go to VCA. If you need to get some blood work evaluated, go to Tricor. If you want to learn something, go to C&M. And if you want to tack, go to Tinta Cantina. We're trying to reach into the markets that could best utilize our service, and that is going to be those who are production dependent. A lot of dentist offices, very good dentist offices, can have a significantly high volume of production the following day. So the tools that they sterilize, the equipment that they prep and make ready for use the following day are of significant value, because without them, they have to cancel appointments, push things off, so on and so forth. So if we can get into that market, and if we can help them assure that the equipment that they're using is sterile, is clean, that their equipment is functioning, in the event of a non-functioning autoclave that would require many days to repair, we also have units that we own and we loan out that come pre-tested, pre-certified, and ready to use. So we can help them bridge that gap and mitigate their risk to loss of production.
I know that doctors' offices and nursing staff tend to need to have continuing education credits and things like that. I don't know about dentists and so on. Would that be a way for you to reach them, to something that gives them course credits around proper sterilization? That way you get your name out there in front of them?
The question was, is there a way for us to kind of piggyback on the need for continuing education for a lot of these professionals? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We're looking at developing a course with Steris that they already have what's called Steris University, and they offer continuing education credits through different accreditations. If we can partner up with their material and present it in a somewhat larger forum, then utilizing their material, we can then pass on the continuing education credits. Other than that, that's the only lead we have on it so far. I mean, we have discussed maybe doing some community center presentations, so on and so forth.
I think it was Ted.
With all the publicity now with the Ebola virus going around, have you approached either the business outlook or the Albuquerque Journal to do an article on your business? That way you get a lot of free publicity.
No, I have not. That's a great idea.
So again, this is asking about using some of the local media in order to get, to highlight the problem.
Yeah, I think if we could partner up with somebody who has a little bit more articulation skills, we could come up with a story that would be worth running and definitely raise awareness.
Rosalie Rayburn is the person that does most of the business articles in the journal. I'll give you my card and maybe you can contact me on.
Great, thank you very much.
I'm curious about the logistics of deploying all the clean equipment out, and kind of touched on it. If that stuff doesn't get to the dental office, they're in trouble if they're relying on your service and something happens in your system or you can't deliver it. I'm kind of curious about your safety nets in place for transporting stuff, delivering it, and then the equipment you're using if it went down.
Well, we don't do the sterilization. So each dental office, let's use dentists for an example here. Each dental office typically has their own autoclave that they operate, that they maintain, and that they should have their own internal procedures in terms of regular service evaluations, testing, so on and so forth. If there is an issue with their autoclave, they can call us for immediate service. If parts are, and oftentimes they are, several days out, then we have our own loaner autoclaves that we certify and we deliver to them, and we can typically get them within the Albuquerque area the same day.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I understand your servicing.
Yeah, the primary service that we're providing, in addition to training, evaluation, and repair, is testing, biological indicators. So we will drop off a spore test, they run it at whatever interval that they choose, we pick it up and we process it the same day and give them results the same day to let them know that for the last week their autoclave has been working properly, so that they can kind of build a fence around their liability. If somebody comes into the dentist and says, now I have hepatitis and I didn't have it and I had an evaluation from you or a cleaning 3-4 weeks ago, how do you know that they didn't get it from them? And they can prove it through logbooks and documentation stating that their autoclave has been functioning properly with the use of biological indicators.
Michael?
I haven't looked at your website, but it sounds like driving traffic to your website could be a really great thing, especially if you had, for instance, videos of customer use cases. For instance, the tattoo studio using it and how much money they saved. If they've had a previous issue with their sterilization where they've lost time and money because of that, and they could talk about your company and how it's benefiting them and how it's benefiting their bottom line.
Right.
Talking about driving traffic and also sort of maybe sharing some of the stories of your customers.
Yeah, the website is, so far, has been our primary source of business. If you do a Google search for autoclave repair Albuquerque, we come up #1. And that's just kind of just passively sitting there. Having something more interactive is definitely worthwhile. I don't really have the background or the time to develop that right now, but utilizing, if I can get customer approval to start utilizing, some of it, here are our current clients, and put a list on there.
Yeah, I think perhaps you could even just have like one-liners about, and then have a picture of the customer or something like that.
Right. One of the advantages about the tattoo shop that we happened to contract with is that they informed us that they just recently became part of what is called the Albuquerque Ethical Guild of Tattooers. I wasn't aware of its existence, but it's a great forum for tattoo owners that do care about doing things correctly, not only for their own protection and their patient safety, but also just doing things ethically and doing things right. So we're trying to get into that forum to where we could present and maybe have a large audience that we can speak to at one time. They seem to be, the tattoo community actually seems to be one of the most receptive areas in this field. We're not getting a whole lot of interest from dental offices because if it's not broke, don't fix it.
So if you're turning around this testing in a day and otherwise it takes them 5 days to send it to California, then there's some advantage there, whether it's in inventory or in how they can service their business. Have you explored any of the kind of financial benefits analysis and documented it into one page or something that says to them, here's a potentially compelling financial reason for you to look at this, not just the safety aspect. Safety aspect's compelling, but if there's a business side and a value side.
To me, the safety aspect is a no-brainer. I mean, if I had a business where I was cutting into people or introducing bloodborne pathogens, or potentially I would want to have this service, it makes sense. But to kind of spotlight a financial incentive, they won't typically respond, or they won't typically know until they say, we can't do production tomorrow because we just got a failed result. In fact, one example, I had a customer call me up. They had a failed BI test that had taken 5 days to achieve the result. They didn't know what was wrong with their equipment, so they ran another BI test, because a lot of times it's operator error. So they run another one, send it back out. Well, it takes another 5 days. I was able to show up, evaluate, repair without replacing any parts, and provide a passing biological indicator the same day while their second one was still in transit. To them, that was value added. That was worthwhile. Getting other people to see that beforehand, before something fails, is the challenge. But I think that's a great idea. If I could put together some sort of a cost sheet.
Yeah, well, a little bit even back to the case study idea. So maybe that's the thing, rapid containment, right? So if you find out 5 days later, how much additional litigation exposure, cost did you face now because you didn't find out until 5 days later, and maybe it's a root cause that you haven't contained for 5 days, and now how many more problems have you created?
Correct. Yeah, there's a liability, there's exposure to risk, but there's also probably something that's more of a driver, and that's loss of production. If they can't process, if they can't produce, and they have to cancel tomorrow's appointments, that's a huge hit for any office.
Let's see. You, sir? And then, yeah.
Because of what we just said here, the rapid processing, have you sought, or is there benefit in trying to get state endorsement in this process? Because it would seem like they would jump on that. And typical medical people say, hey, what is the best thing we can do? We want to do that.
Right.
They would not typically ignore that best approach.
We're starting at the city level with the Environmental Health Department. We're reaching out to them. Haven't heard anything back yet, so we're going to keep knocking. The State Department, the New Mexico Department of Health, has recommendations. The Center for Disease Control, national level, has recommendations, but there's no teeth. There's no enforcement. There's just no oversight, and there's no inspection. When you go into a restaurant and you walk into that restaurant and you see posted on the door, the health department approved, well, you don't see that on dentist offices or doctor's offices. And it's unfortunate, but they're kind of out, just hanging out in terms of liability, and they leave it up to the individual practice.
Gary?
Yeah, I own a medical company and I'm at the city, so I was going to suggest the same thing, and that is, if you could get this past my CFO, then you get it past anyone, and I know what he would say is, what would appeal to him is okay, I'm going to mitigate your risk. I'm going to tell your insurance company you're doing this. It's all going to be third party. You're going to have instant results versus 5-day results. And I'm going to put a sticker on your door and in your literature telling all your patients that you're that you're in compliance with all the CDC regulations, and I'm going to give it to you free for a month, and then we'll see if you want to continue. He'd do it like that. I mean, so I think
That's what we're driving towards.
I think that's a really good way to do it, and to go after the insurance companies and the state government, city government to require faster results. A lot of times the regulators don't know when there's new technologies and new ways of doing things.
One of the things that we rely on is documentation for everything. And so having our own internal procedures for chain of custody, dropping off the samples, retrieving the samples, processing the samples, and then documenting all the test results electronically, notifying the client immediately of a pass or fail. How do we notify them if there's a failure, so on and so forth. We do all of this at what I feel is a price point that's just a no-brainer. The current method is, again, wait 5 days. They pay about, with a postage stamp, they're paying about $3. We can do everything same day with free drop-off, pickup, documentation for $12. And so the shop that has one autoclave, I mean, it's $12 a week as opposed to $3 a week. It all adds up, but it reduces liability. And if they can receive some sort of accreditation or reduction in their insurance premiums, then I'm sure that everyone would see the value in it.
Mike, and then Tim, and then probably maybe Scott with the last one.
Following up on this idea about the government intervention is licensing boards. Licensing boards a lot of times write their own regulations and don't have to wait for legislation to give them the authority to approve. They won't, I don't think, endorse your company, but they may endorse your method. And if you're the only one doing it, you've got an open door. So I think one of the ideas I would suggest is putting together a video presentation of exactly what you do that runs 3 to 5 minutes and get it into the hands of all of the different regulatory boards and then try to get appointments.
Yeah, it's a great idea. OSHA right now seems to be the scariest one in the room in terms of who people are listening to. We've gotten calls from people that need to have documentation, they need to have testing, and it's all driven from internal mock OSHA or OSHA audits. So that seems to be an area of regulation that has a little bit more teeth, and maybe we could start there.
Tim?
Oh, I was just going to bring up the insurance carrier. It seems like they have a financial stake, and I wouldn't wait for somebody else's certification. I'd create your own.
One of the very first things I thought about when coming up with this business idea was that I want to provide it, but at the end of the day, I want to be the regulatory authority. So if somebody else wants to start doing this sort of servicing and accreditation, they have to go through my test. And then that way we create a standardization.
Scott?
And the idea occurred to me as Gary was talking, that as part of the standardization effort, you know, it might be a broadening of your product base, but it would certainly help that certification if you were able to say, we're going to come in and audit what's in your room, and you're not necessarily auditing for specific pathogens, but maybe the absence of bacteria. That this is a really clean space. That we hardly picked up anything well within the range, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that way you're not having to spend expensive tests on the specifics, but you can just make a general plan. It's very, very clean in here, and the autoclave is good, et cetera.
Maybe, would that be something that would be better handled by like an industrial hygienist or a company that we could commission to help define that? That way there's no conflict of interest?
I think there's folks in that realm in the food safety area.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a standard last question that we ask every week, and that is, you know, what can we as a community do to help you grow your business?
You just did it. Lots of suggestions, advice. I mean, that's why I'm here. I love fixing things, and that's my primary driver. I like working on machines. This is a neat way for me to get in to be able to work on those machines. But in terms of the logistics, marketing, development, so on and so forth, that's what I need help with. And I appreciate you guys' questions and answers. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Appreciate your time. Thank you. All right.
Joe Cardillo. Welcome, Joe. Thank you.
Cool.
You actually don't need this.
Oh.
Actually, yeah.
Do I need this as well? Okay, cool. All right. All right. So my name is Joe Cardillo. I'm the Deputy Director over at the New Mexico Compass. We're a journalism startup. We've been around for about 1.5 years now, and we're just sort of rebooting after a little bit of time off. I think it's always important to sort of talk about what what the problem is that you're really addressing if you're a startup, right? Because that's sort of the biggest barrier, I think, to entry. So I'm not going to get really deep into that because I think most of us sort of know journalism is really an industry that's in crisis. Larger publications like the Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and others are struggling, but particularly local and regional publications are really having a hard time. They traditionally have a background that's really heavy on research and coverage and storytelling, maybe not so great when it comes to presentation on the web, not so great with monetization models, that type of thing. And a lot of the local and regional newspapers that are across the US, particularly in medium-sized cities, are really having a hard time paying their bills, and a lot of their cash still comes from print publications, which is a problem because print is dying. So that's a real sort of issue that still exists, and we're seeing a lot of that. Most of you are probably familiar with various digital projects by the Times, the Post, Vox Media, Huffington Post, others like that. But a lot of that stuff you're seeing is really expensive, and it takes a long time. You hire a developer to help you do charts and graphs and other kinds of materials, and that can be $60K a year easy, just minimum, right? It could go up to 200, 300, 500 grand to have a unit of developers that are basically news savvy. So that's really difficult. The other problem is that the newer media orgs, like the Vox and the BuzzFeed types, are really still sort of stuck in a clickbait model, right? You know how they're paying for their serious journalism, like BuzzFeed has a long-form journalism section, which is actually pretty good. But they're paying for it on a model where they're sending out a bunch of listicles and getting millions and millions of click-throughs, and that's tied into Facebook and other sorts of channels. Local and regional news orgs really can't use that model. They'll get castigated pretty heavily, and we've seen a few try that, and it hasn't worked out really well. So the real challenge for local sort of community-oriented papers, whether it's a small city or a town, is to be responsive to communities and sort of open the gates up. They have to get better at presentation. They have to get better at monetization. They have to figure out how to make money off of what they do. And that's a really sort of difficult challenge, and there aren't actually a lot of people addressing that really well. So the New Mexico Compass is a nonprofit. Our big thing is transparent open access journalism, which basically just translates to we're building a model that we want anyone to steal from. We don't care. We're not doing the proprietary thing. That's very different from print publications who come from a different background. Any project we do, if you can take the code from that project and hack it to your own means, we're psyched on that. We're excited. So we both want to increase sort of the quality of information and the access to information. And then the second part of our mission is really connected to our nonprofit parent, which is about teaching and educating journalists and news orgs how to do this sort of stuff really quickly, really nimbly, without a huge budget. So that's sort of kind of the crux of what we're about. So where we're at right now, we're just in the middle of a redesign of our site. We're about to launch our new blog. The next couple weeks should be really interesting. We're going to start doing crowdfunding for our first major reporting project. It's a database of public records around officer-involved shootings here in the city of Albuquerque. And then our sort of other big thing is defining our growth metrics. So some of you are really familiar with lean metrics or lean analytics, that type of model. Typically in publishing, that's going to revolve around views, return views, audience loyalty, subscriptions, that type of stuff. So we're kind of working on figuring that part of it out a little bit, and I think we're well on our way. And then the last, I think I doubled up on my slides. And the last piece is really about structuring coverage and education. So right now, our three major projects, two are in process. One is really better access to public records here in the city and in the state. And then the second major sort of coverage area is net neutrality. So it has to do with access to information, particularly in rural communities outside of Albuquerque, where there's really not a lot of news media and there's not a lot of coverage on those areas. So that's kind of our major coverage areas. And then the third part, which we're going to start doing, is looking at how we can cover sort of the tech ecosystem and entrepreneurship, so folks like ourselves in this room. So that's sort of the quick and dirty version of it. The only other thing I'll say is that like our challenges right now that we're sort of really struggling with are trying to figure out how we monetize, our model. Obviously, it's probably going to be a hybrid. We're looking at grants, we're looking at subscription model, we're looking at funding by project, stuff like that. So we're really open to kind of hearing what people think about that.
Thank you, Joe.
Cool. Do you want to flip that slide to the other one real quick? Cool. And Eric is somewhere. Oh, there you are. Okay. Do you want to hang out, or do you want to actually take the questions officially?
I'll be your
Okay. All right.
assistant.
Let's do it.
Questions? John?
With an open source platform, does that mean that you accept stories and coverage from people all around the state?
You can repeat those if you can.
Yeah, so the question is, as an open source organization, do we accept coverage or content from people outside of our organization and from around the state? Not right now. That is a potential model that we're looking at. I think a lot of folks are familiar with some of the pitfalls of what's called citizen journalism. We don't really believe in citizen journalism because it suggests that there's a different bar that's set for citizens versus journalists. I think we're all journalists. If that's in the field that we're in, if that's what you want to do, you should be sort of set up to do the ethics of it. So I think there's a lot of problems with that, but we definitely want to do that. We want to have people who live in Gallup or Raton or Cloudcroft be able to cover the issues that are important in their city. And through mentorship and the education side of the nonprofit, I think we're going to be looking at really home-growing reporters here in the state that can actually contribute coverage. So that's coming, but it's something we're thinking very carefully about.
So I'm familiar with that you've been sort of in the entrepreneurial world, working with startups. And one of the things that fascinated me about this is, what was it about New Mexico Compass that got you intrigued to kind of, to move from, making money to something that's, still needs to be sustainable, but is a kind of a nonprofit venture?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, Eric knows me well, so it's why the move from a fairly lucrative product-oriented background to a nonprofit journalism org? I think it's a fantastic question. I've had about 6 years of experience in legacy and startup environments, and I've always loved journalism. I've always loved storytelling. I've always sort of had a keen eye for it, and I'm not a journalist. I don't report or write, but I've always loved the business of the news and been really curious about it. And there's no money in journalism, right? Which I think Eric was alluding to. It's a hard business to be in. And in fact, most journalists, and most journalism orgs are really in that place where, man, you're not going to make a lot of money off of one particular thing. You have to have a diverse revenue stream, right? That's a challenge. So for me, part of it is I like to bite off the biggest possible problem. That's kind of my style. I love journalism, and I saw a chance to work with my partners, who are both longtime journalists here in New Mexico, worked for the Alibi, the Tribune, Daily Lobo, really talented reporters, and I thought, hey, I have a product kind of experience. What can I do to bring that to bear to the presentation and the distribution and all these sort of questions about how to monetize it? So.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
About your crowdsourcing. What's your kind of plan for that? What are you going to focus that around?
Mm-hmm.
I know a few people in the crowd have done crowdsourcing. So.
Yeah, totally. So the question was just a little more detail on the crowdsourcing project we're going to do and what we may plan on doing in the future. So there are a few that do it really well, like Center for Investigative Reporting and ProPublica in particular. What we've found, and I think if you look at the landscape for journalism, it's hard to get money just to do anything you want, and I think that's probably a good thing. I'm a fan of that. But you can get money through crowdfunding for specific projects that address needs, right? Particularly if they're really underserved. So we sort of looked at some of those models to figure out how we would do this, and our project with this interactive database that's going to include really a ton of primary source materials from officer-involved shootings here, it's going to be about creating a database that journalists, policymakers, citizens, really anybody can look at and explore, find stories in, and perhaps share that material or share what they might have access to. And that sort of transparency is really big. And I think when we researched sort of, do we crowdfund this particular project? That was the thing we thought of. We thought, what do people really need and want access to? And so we've got this project sort of ready to go in the next couple weeks. You would be nothing in crowdfunding if you didn't already have a list of influencers and people that you've had a chat with. So we've talked to people at the New York Times, PBS, CIR, ProPublica, all sorts of local and regional publications, and I think we're going to get some success. But you have to sort of set the stage for that so that people know what you're doing and why.
Yeah, I'd say even make it kind of a cookie cutter approach, not just the database, but how to get the data in and share that. So
Totally.
You're going to share this and let other people use that same process.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really nice point. I don't know if you all caught that, but sort of like the cookie cutter approach. And in fact, if we do this project really well, what I'd like to do is apply for grants to do this in other cities, right? Because lots of other cities are having issues with transparency and public records. So why not, if it works here and it's a good model, why not extend it? Right. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Gary?
So your name is New Mexico Compass. So
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about your true north. What is your guiding principles?
So I think you got sort of a touch of that, in our sort of our mission statement, right? Which is sort of our one sentence what we're about. At the most core level, I think that great journalism is really about giving people access to ask questions and to hear stories and to learn and to develop and educate themselves. So that's really at the core of what we're doing. And what we've seen is that there's not enough of that here. It's a super underserved need. And particularly, I have friends who do the kind of big time news thing in other cities, and they get paid a lot more. They probably have access to better tools and resources than a journalist might have here. So really the core of it for us, besides the coverage part of it, is the nonprofit education side. We want to empower journalists. We want to teach people how to do this well. It's not about clickbait. It's not about the quick and easy thing. It's about building a consistent sort of process and a storytelling process and having ethics, while you do that. And that's, the education for people who are looking to be in journalism is really sort of lacking in this area. So
in line with your ethics idea, what are you doing, what kind of safeguards do you have in place for vetting your information, vetting your reporters' information?
Yeah. So the question was, in regards to ethics, what sort of processes do we have in place to vet information or stories that come in? So right now it's really a 3 or 4 person shop, right? So my co-founders, Marisa DeMarco and Margaret Wright, are experienced journalists, 10 plus years doing that sort of thing. And we're being really careful about people that we bring in to even do freelancing because we want to sort of mentor that process and build a structure from that, right? To go, okay, cool, here's how we can apply this in the future. In general, and I think that's a really interesting question because it sort of touches on a problem, right? In general, as sort of news orgs move to the BuzzFeed model and other similar type models, ethics that's back there, right? It's not as important anymore. And while, a lot of us might sort of not look at it, I think we're all pretty aware of it when we read the content. We're like, that seems a little, you have that moment of comprehension, and I see that all the time, both in myself and others. So, we stick to really strict ethics. AP, SPJ, which is the Society for Professional Journalists, it's sort of the main body that defines ethics. And we're really, really committed to moving slower if we have to in some cases. To use a really practical example, I'm sure most of you saw a little bit of the Leo York sort of controversy over whether he was reporting or simply just sending materials up in Ferguson, all sorts of questions that get raised by that type of thing. We really want to retain that ethical standpoint, and we want to teach people to do it right too.
So in reporting, it's challenging to stay away, I would imagine, from the TMZ, hey, here's a pertinent thing that's interesting to people, whether it's very deep and meaningful, but you also have to have eyeballs at some point. You have to have people looking. So do you plan to have a mix of lighter and deeper material? Or
Great question. So the sort of quick summary is, what about the TMZ style information? What do we do? Do we need those eyeballs to monetize the model? Do we mix lighter content with deeper content? Really wonderful question. And I think, I mentioned BuzzFeed, one of the most interesting examples. Huffington Post is also a really interesting example because they started out a lot lighter than they are. I don't know if any of you watch the live feeds at Huffington Post, but it's some of it's really, really great stuff. It's pretty interesting. To answer your question directly, I think that's a TBD for us. We're still sort of figuring that out. My experience from a product background is focus. Everybody has ideas, but the people who execute on ideas are the people who really get where they're going. So we're trying to keep our focus narrow right now in terms of coverage areas and how we're going to monetize it, and then sort of expand. I do think we probably will sort of expand into more cultural-oriented content that might not be as sort of topically serious. I will say one thing, which is that there is a temptation to do link bait, right? You won't find any top 10 lists on our site of stuff. It's just not going to happen. That's not what we're in the business of doing. I don't have a problem with it, and I read lots of that stuff too, but I think that's sort of the cheap and easy thing, and I think it takes guts and determination to build a company or to build a journalism org, either way. And you see that in the types of content marketing, right? Lots of you read the same stuff I do, I'm sure, where you're like, that's just not a useful piece of content to me at all. I know way too much about that, unfortunately. So.
There was this article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago comparing Picasso's full series of drawings and paintings to the Apple mouse, and it was a very short article. It created a lot of really, really rich commentary.
Interesting.
So it would be interesting to take and drive social media to these types of smaller articles that, you know, drive controversy and commentary.
So you're...
It's not a really good question. I just
Yeah.
if you're interested in that type of thing.
Yeah.
Social media.
Right. Well, I mean, it raises a great question, right? Bite-sized media, right? And so I've done lots of marketing and product and operations, and I've preached the sort of gospel of, oh, look, these people are not going to pay attention to your content. You better bite-size it, right? You better create quick clips. You better create an infographic. You better cut that infographic up and share that over your channels. And it's true that works, right? And it's true that controversy works. But if you're building something sustainably over time, you can't just do that, right? I think and I think that's sort of a really good example of something you can do, but that can't be all you do, right? That's sort of the danger.
Drive traffic.
Yeah. But here's the thing, and I'm gonna lay out my cards in terms of how I see web traffic, right? A lot of it is BS. And you know who sells ads based on this stuff is all sorts of publishers, all sorts of companies. And I mean, if you go back and you look at ad fraud and click-throughs and click farms and all the various sort of modes, I mean, a lot of that traffic is junk, right? Anybody who runs a B2B company in here knows that already, right? Because you're like, God, we got a ton of hits on our site, but we got 3 inquiries on our contact form. Who cares about those hits? You need those, you need people to get in touch with you to be interested in what you're doing. So, I mean, and I think you're going to see it, right? Like we just saw that story about Facebook like killing clickbait headlines. That's a cheap thing that has been happening forever. I don't read Upworthy.
Yeah. So that's a really, really wonderful point. And basically, like, sort of, how do you draw the line in the sand? How do you create the structure to decide what goes and doesn't go? And in journalism, that's really all you have, right? It's sort of like, here's what we're about, here's what we do, and here's where we won't go. Because we're an open source, transparent model, there is zero influence from any funding we get, which makes my job harder because I got to fund this thing. That's part of my responsibility right now, is to figure out how to get some cash in the door. And we can certainly do ad revenues and sponsored content and subscriptions, but there's going to be zero feedback or coverage because of that. And that's explicitly in our mission. That's on our page. That's something we've all talked about and been really clear about. I think the real challenge to kind of address what you're talking about is you have to set up the structure as best you can and know that you're going to run into things you don't anticipate. It's just going to happen. But if you have the right culture and the right ethics and a mission statement to guide who you are and what you're about as an organization, you can come to those situations and go, we have to think about that, and okay, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're not going to do. So yeah, point very well taken. Yeah.
Is there any interest or any room for you to collaborate with SPJ?
Yeah.
It seems like this would be in their interest.
So the question was, is there room for us to collaborate with SPJ, which is the Society for Professional Journalists, or other organizations that are similar, because there are a few. Definitely there's room, and I mean, I've had some talks with various people that are in the kind of space that we're really starting to occupy, the ProPublicas of the world. And so we're starting to have conversations, because I think that's really where it's at. It's not about like going out and being like, hey, what can you do for me? It's about like, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's figure out how we might work with each other in the future, or perhaps how I might just be helpful to you, right? And if you have a follow-up, go for it. Yeah.
No, just,
Yeah.
you know, I actually know the leadership there, so.
Oh, cool.
Follow.
That'd be great. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so where we're at right now, and I think someone else mentioned this, but like where we're at right now, and this is very much my product background come to bear, is we're at the traction stage. I'm not interested in one-time partnerships. I'm interested in very carefully sort of building this thing, getting enough traction, so that when we have those conversations and build those relationships, they'll be useful in both directions, because that's what we're thinking about. Yeah. So I think we're just right before that, but hopefully that's coming down the line.
And what kind of nonprofit are you?
501c3. Yeah, we're actually in the process of becoming a 501c3. We're waiting on the IRS to do what they do, which is take a while to approve it. Yeah. All that.
And the final question that we like to wrap up with is, what can we as a community do to help you?
I thought about that. So in terms of what you as a community can do to help the Compass and myself, I mean, in some ways, it's sort of like what Sean said earlier. Like, we really need information, right? We're covering Albuquerque. We're covering New Mexico. We need to know what's important to people. So in light of that, I actually would love to have you write your name and your email down, and I'll send you a survey that I have. It's like a customer development survey. It's going to ask you questions about what sort of things you don't see getting covered that you'd like to see covered. What your perceptions of different types of publications are, whether that's print or web or broadcast, that type of thing. So I'd love to have folks both fill out that survey and also send it off to people. It'd be really, really interesting to get some of that feedback.